Hello coders, it's been a minute, hasn't it? It's been a while. I'm going to do some tutorials. I'm going to at least try and do some tutorials today. The saying work smarter, not harder comes to mind. So the plan is to work on some PHP 8 tutorials. I've got a couple of them that I want to get through today. And the idea is that I'm going to clip these and then put them as YouTube videos, tutorials to support a Learn PHP course that I have for howtocodewell.net. I'll show you what that looks like in the browser. So we've got Learn PHP 8, and there is the constructor property promotion, match statement, null safe operator, sensitive parameter attribute, union types, named arguments, and attributes. And of course, there's going to be a lot more because there's far more features available in PHP 8, such as, the recent stuff that's come out in 8.5, for instance, the piping. That's going to be an interesting one to do. But I've done videos for the constructor property promotion and the match statement. So I need to do videos for the rest of them. Once I've got those down, I'll then write some more tutorials and then record those as I go. So if I jump back to here for a minute, what I'm going to try and do is have a break between each tutorial. And in that break, we can have a chat if anybody comes on and wants to ask me any questions or just wants to hang out, then that's cool. And I'll use that period of time as a sort of a check in when I do the editing. So I know that that's when the tutorial starts and when that tutorial ends. So the chat won't be enabled on the tutorials themselves, although it is in this mode here. So I will look at the chat once the tutorial is done. So this is the setup. Let's have a look. Let's get into the actual thing here. So what we have is the PHP 8 course. This is the files that I have at the minute. So we've done the property promotion and we've also done the match statement. So you can see that there's a lot of tutorials just for the match statement itself. So what I want to do for, say, the attributes, the null safe operator, the sensitive attributes, and the union types is do a tutorial that covers all of this. So Boolean example, redundant aliases, and self, for instance. And I think what I'll probably work on first is perhaps we'll start relatively small and we'll do the shall we do the null safe operator, because that's relatively straightforward to do, I think. Or shall I do the attributes? The attributes themselves, you've got the timer example, that requires some reflection. Just thinking, named arguments as well. Maybe I shall work on the named arguments first, because that's relatively straightforward. We'll do the named arguments first, I think. The date example here. The constructor has two. I'm just reading all of this. We don't need to supply the first argument, blah, 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 blah. So as I'll go, I will, if I go down to, if I open this up, and do an ls, go into, which is this, the named arguments place. And if I ran this with here, we'll stop at the var dump, or we'll get to the var dump, we'll print out the date. So we do PHP, I'm on 8.4 at the minute. And if we did minus F, and we're in named arguments, this is date example. So we have this output. Let's see what this is doing. We don't need to supply the first argument of date time, as this is set to now by default. Okay, yes. So if we scrolled up to here, it says run PHP RC date time and view the constructor signature. The constructor has two arguments, date, time, and time zone. Both arguments are optional. We can skip the first argument by naming the second as shown below. Okay, yeah. So what I'll do first is I'll run this in the tutorial, and that will demonstrate that we have this output, and I'm looking for the constructor method. I wonder if there's a way of filtering this out. The class, that's the class itself, that's the static properties, that's set state, create from timestamp, get last errors, construct, here we go. Yes, so we've got two arguments. We've got the date time, which is defaulting to now, and we have the time zone, which is defaulting to null. And this tutorial will demonstrate the fact that we don't actually need to supply the first argument in order to supply the second argument, because we have the named arguments here that we can go straight into time zone, Europe, London, and that will automatically set the date time to be now. So we don't need to supply the first argument, date time, as this is set to now by default. So date, new date time, time zone, like so. And that's what we've printed out in our, datetime.php example. Before PHP 8, both the first and second arguments would be needed. Yes, so in order to supply the time zone before PHP 8, we would need to supply the first argument, which is now. So that's what this tutorial does, or this example does. And then the next example is positional and named arguments. So there's a function say hello, takes a string, which is first name, last name, and age. So it echoes out hello, first name, last name, and you are a specific age. So we run that, and positional arguments must come before the named arguments. So we must supply the positional argument of Peter without the named argument. So that's positional, that's position 1, before any of this stuff. And then this will throw an error. So here I've got first name is Peter. So that's the named argument, and this was be the positional argument, so that will be position 2, and that will throw an error because we can't supply positional arguments after named arguments. So for example, if I was to say uncomment this and save that, you can see that there's the red lines here, and if I was to run php-f of positional and named arguments, we get this fatal error, cannot use positional arguments after the named argument. Okay, so that's a relatively straightforward thing. Hello Exabyte3, I think your category needs to be, I don't know what that is, because I've got asterisks, so I don't really know what that means. So where you've said I think your category needs to be, whatever the category is you've said it needs to be is ... or asterisk. It's software and game development. Oh, they've finally got a software and game development. Have they really? That is interesting. Can I change this category whilst I'm live? I haven't done Twitch in a very long time. Let's see if I can do that. Community, content, is that it? Settings, maybe. Stream. I don't know if we can. I don't know. There must be a way of doing this, right? Can I do this on in here maybe? I don't know. This is all very strange. Of course, I started this machine up and OBS just was like, oh, you need an update. And then it updated, and then it was all the pencil icon. Where is the pencil icon? In Stream Manager. There is many pencil icons. Or do you mean the 3 dots? Hide player, activity feed, collaboration. Oh, this is such a confusing layout. compared to say YouTube, this is just a mess on the Twitch dashboard. Okay, I'm on the Twitch dashboard. This is ridiculous. Everybody's like just trying to watch me actually do. Here we go. Right, there's the bigger pencil. The bigger pencil. Right, we'll take that off. And you've suggested it should be software and game development. Let's have a look. Software. Oh, wow, there is software and game development. This didn't used to be a thing when I was streaming beforehand. That's changed. Thank you very much, Exabyte3. I appreciate that. So, going back to this, I'm going to do a quick sort of tutorial based on these two examples, where we have the date example where we're not having to pass in the first argument to allow us to pass in the time zone. So before PHP 8, we would need to do this in order to give the time zone, right? And then after that, I'm going to do a positional and named arguments example where we create a say hello function returning a string. And this, if I was to comment this out, save that, run the code, that should have passed. Why is that not passing? Oh, that needs to not return a thing, doesn't it? It's void. Yeah, that's better. So that's gonna say hello Peter Fisher, you are 41, and that's because we're calling the function and that's the positional argument of the first argument, and it needs to be, if it's a positional argument, it needs to be the first argument in this list of arguments. If we try and do a positional argument within the middle, say, or after a named argument, then we get an error, as I'll demonstrate now. So I'll just run that and it will just throw an error, cannot use positional argument after named argument. Personally, what I do is I always use named arguments, and I always have a trailing comma now at the end, because it's just easier to read the changes in a git commit. Okay, so Exabyte3, I think it's important to mention in the tutorial that arguments can be positional or optionally named. No special syntax in the parameter list to make a parameter named. Yes, I think this is because there are other languages that have special syntax to make the parameters named. Oh, I see. Okay. So, I mean, all we need for a named parameter is the name of the parameter, right? So we have the name, first name, last name, and age. So all we need to do to have a named argument is to define the name of the argument in which we want to supply. With a positional argument, you don't. You just supply the argument. But the rule is that you obviously need to have the positional argument before any of the named arguments. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to grab a drink and then we'll crack on. Right, I'm going to switch to another mode here, which will remove the chat. So you can still chat and talk, but I will not see this on the screen because this is tutorial mode, if that makes sense. I'll do the intros and the outros and all of that gubbins once I get this done. Okay, so let's make some room here. We need the terminal to be up. Let's clear that down. And it's the positional argument, and the first one is going to be the date time, and I need to also show the date time RC off of that. Oh, I didn't know that about Dart. See, I can see the chat. Okay, so we should do is, I'm just getting this right in my head, say that, do this. It's not actually that, it's this one. That's what we need to work on first. We'll get rid of that as well. Okay. Named arguments. Let's bring that a bit closer. PHP. Okay. Okay. Run PHP RC and view the constructor. An update to PHP 8 is to allow named arguments in our function and method calls. If, for instance, I ran PHP RC datetime, I can see the signature of the datetime class. So I'm going to run that in the terminal here. And if I go to the constructor method, which is up here, we get to it. So we've got the get offset, get time zone, the date time, the wake up, the unserialized. We get to these magic methods. Here we go. We've got the two arguments that the date time class takes. The first argument is date time, and it's defaulting to the value of now. The second argument is a time zone, and it's optional, and it is defaulting to null. Let's say, for example, I only want to supply the time zone. Well, I can do that in PHP 8. I wasn't able to do that before PHP 8. I would have to supply the date time before supplying the time zone. So as an example down here, we've got time zone, and we're instantiating a new date time zone, and we're supplying the time zone parameter or argument as Europe London. And if I scroll down, we do not need to supply the now parameter for the date time before we supply the time zone. So now we can do date, and we instantiate that to a new date time zone, where time zone is the time zone that we've just created above. Before PHP 8, we would of course have to supply the date time, like so. So we would need to do date time and then supply now. Whoops. But with PHP 8, with our named properties, we don't need to do that. I should really stop calling this named properties. It's named arguments. Right, I'll do all that again. I'll do that all again. You'll have to bear with me. I might have to do this a couple of times. Okay, let's clear that down. Actually, let's just find a way of grepping this to be the constructor. I've done this before, haven't I? Okay, no, I need to get, that's not going to work because it's just going to grep that one line. That's frustrating. Let's do that, and it's somewhere up. Oh my god, it's so long. Yeah, here. I tell you what, I just keep that on the screen. I think that might help, rather than have to run it and search for it. Okay. One of the features that has been added to PHP 8 is named arguments. Named arguments allows us to supply the arguments of methods, functions, and classes in a way that we name the arguments without a positional set of where the arguments go. I'll give you a quick demonstration here using the datetime class. So the datetime class has two arguments for its constructor. As we can see down here, we have the date time, which is set to now by default. We also have a date time zone, which is set to null by default, and it's optional. But let's say, for example, we want to supply the date time zone without actually supplying the date time, because the date time is going to be set to now anyway. So to do that, what we can do is use named arguments. Here's an example where we have the time zone set to a new date time zone object, supplying the time zone named argument of Europe London. We can now supply this time zone to the date time object without actually supplying the date time argument. We can do that by supplying the time zone argument to the time zone that we've created above. As an example, if I ran the avar dump of date, so I will do that now. So we'll clear that down and we'll run PHP -f of the name of the date time example. We can now see that we have the date time object with the time zone set to Europe London, and the date has already been set for us to the current date. Now, before PHP 8, of course, we would need to supply the first argument first. So we would need to do now as the string and then the time zone for this to actually happen. Okay, let's move on to another example of named arguments, and that is the difference between positional arguments and named arguments. So in positional and named arguments.php here, we have an example of a function that says say hello. It's going to output a string, so hello the first name, last name, and then an age. So it takes a string, which is the first name, a string, that's the last name, and an integer, which is an age. So when we call it, we can call it using a positional argument. So the first argument here is a positional argument, and it's positional because it doesn't have a name associated to it. The second and third argument, these are named arguments. The last name and the age, we're defining the name of those arguments. So the last name is Fisher, the age is 41. Now, the rule of thumb here is that we have to set positional arguments before we set named arguments. Otherwise, we get an error, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here we have the first argument, which is Peter. That is a positional argument. And then the next two arguments are named arguments because we're defining the name of the arguments that we're supplying. If we scroll down here, we can see that actually this is going to throw an error if we try and define a positional argument after a named argument. And you can see that my IDE actually gives this with a red underline, meaning that there is an error. So if I save this and ran the code, this should give us an error. So let's change that to be our positional and named arguments example. And the error we've got is cannot use positional argument after named argument in, and then that is the address to the file on line 18. So this here is line 18. The error is because we're supplying a positional argument after a named argument. To fix this, what I could do is type last name like so and give it a named argument, and if I was to run this again, it will work. So named arguments are really useful in PHP. One of an experience that I've had before on a legacy code base is where we had lots of methods, lots of functions in the code base. And by lots, I mean huge amounts of arguments. Some of them were defaults, some of them were null, some of them had different data types, some of them didn't even have any data types associated to them. And when we dug into the code base, we found out that some of these arguments weren't actually being used. So we could actually reduce our calls to these functions and to these methods by actually defining the arguments that we wanted and needed to call at that particular time. And then afterwards, we were able to do some refactoring to remove the redundant arguments or to reduce them once we had cleared out some of the technical debt and done some refactoring. So when you're working on legacy code, named arguments is a real benefit. Also, what I like to do when I create named arguments is put each argument on a separate line. And each argument will end with a trailing comma, like so. I also like putting the named arguments on separate lines because I personally find it's far more readable. Let's say, for example, this was all on one line, like so. I personally don't think this is very readable at all, especially when you get over, say, 5 or 6 arguments in a call. By having it down on a separate line, it means that I can say, oh yeah, that's first name is Peter, and I don't need to worry about what the last name is or what the age is. Also, when I'm reviewing PRs, it's nice to see that the adjustment is on just a single line rather than an adjustment that could affect another argument before or after that. So that is PHP named arguments in PHP 8. Okay, so that's that. I will edit and do all the shenanigans for that. God. I haven't done tutorials in a while, as you can probably notice. Let's see. We need to move on to, let's save that. I need to remove whatever I've done here. There we go. Next thing I need to do is, oh, there was a same arguments thing as well. Yeah, I probably should do that. This is where we have, you can't supply the same named argument. And I don't think you can do, I mean, it's a bit of common sense here, isn't it? But we can't do that. Yeah. So let me just do a little quick thing on that. So we'll go back to our tutorial here, and we'll get rid of this. Okay. A thing to note when using named arguments is that an argument needs to be unique. We can't have 2 arguments of the same. As you can see here, we have say name, and we're trying to call say name with 2 arguments. Even if I was to create an argument of the same name, so say name like this, and then ran this, it's going to throw an error. So let's do same name, same arguments.php. We have a fatal redefinition of the parameter name on line 3. So let's remove this and run this again. We're still going to get that error. So uncaught exception, named parameter name overwrites the previous argument. So it overrides the previous argument because they are the same argument. They're called the same thing. So I even, I'm going to do that again. Let me clear that down. Let's do that again. Clear. Something to note when it comes to named arguments is that an argument needs to be unique. We can't name 2 arguments of the same, and we can't call 2 arguments of the same name either. In this example, we have the say name function where it just echoes out the string that you pass. What we're trying to do here is call the say name function with 2 arguments that are the same, so name and name. And as you can see, my IDE here has highlighted this in red, but let's actually see what the error message is. So if we ran php-f same arguments.php, the error that we get is that the named parameter name overrides the previous argument. So this argument is overriding this argument, and it's causing PHP to have a fatal uncaught error. Also, if we were to create a second argument of the same name, so say string name, and save that, we get a redefinition of parameter error. So this is a redefinition of parameter name in, and then you've got the path to the file on line 3. So we cannot have the same argument named the same. We can't have 2 arguments or more named the same, and we cannot call 2 arguments or more with the same named argument. Okay, that will do. Let's move back over to I need to sort out my Stream Deck because I'm having to use OBS to jump backwards and forwards, and it's being a pain. So let's move now. Let's clear that down. Actually, I don't want to change. There we go. So that's the named argument one. Excuse me. Let's do null safe operator. This is fun. I love this. This is probably one of the features in PHP that I've used the most, especially around legacy code, because with legacy code, I don't want to say all legacy code is bad, but when dealing with code that hasn't been updated in a long while, you can't always be sure what's being returned correctly, and in some cases things get returned null when perhaps you weren't expecting it to be returning a null. And so with the null safe operator, you can basically condense the call down to null, and you can prevent the calling of future chained events, chained functions, if this was null. So for example, if the user repository is null, then we don't call the find by ID. And if the find by ID of 14 returns null, then we don't call the get name. So this is really, really useful, especially for legacy code or for code that goes through several steps, and each step could return null. And this line here gets reduced, or this line here is basically the equivalent of this. So if is null user repository, then the result is null. Else user repository find by ID of 14. If is null user, then the result is null. Else the result is user get name, and then we var dump the result. So this will return null, obviously, and this will also return null. So I'll give you an example. If we just comment all of this out, it's so powerful. I love this. Oh, I'm not actually showing the screen. Let's let's go back and I'll show you what I mean, because I'm sorry about that. So this is the null safe operator. Apologies. The null safe operator is a way of condensing down your calls and checking whether or not the calls return null. And if they do, it prevents the future calls or the next calls within the chain. So for example, here we've got the user repository of null, and it checks if that is null. And if that is null, then we don't call the find by ID of 14. If that isn't null, then we do call the find by ID of 14, but we're also checking if that's null. If that returns null, then we don't do anything. We return null. If it doesn't return null, we then get the name. So the name can either be null, depending on the state of each one of these calls, or it can be the name that's returned. So this is incredibly powerful. And as I was saying earlier, this is what really helps when you're working on, say, legacy code or code that goes through several iterations of calls, where each call could potentially return null. And this single line here is the equivalent. Let's just get rid of this so I'd show you a bit more room here. This is essentially the equivalent of this huge amount of checks. So the first check is null of the user repository. Now we haven't defined the user repository, so it's going to be null. So the result is therefore null. Else, let's say the user repository isn't null, then we call find by ID of 14. If the user, that is the result of this find by ID call, is null, then the result is null. Else, the result is the name, get name of the user, and we var dump that here. So this is the equivalent of that. How powerful is this? I'll give you a demonstration. If we were to comment this out and load this up, I think we're in, where are we? We're not in named arguments anymore. We're in null safe. And if we ran a PHP-F of index, I don't know why I called it index, but anyway, index, that's returning null, right? Before, that would return a huge error. I think if we were to do this, take these out, right, and we ran this, it's going to throw an error because it's undefined. Yeah, fatal uncall error, call to member function, find by ID on null. So this is null. I've called this, and it's going to cause an error, a fatal error, because user repository isn't set. And so I use the null safe operators around these calls, and it will go, okay, well, if that isn't set, then it's null, and therefore we won't do anything else. Okay, that's returning null, so we won't call get name. We'll just return null. So name, in this instance, is going to be null. However, not however, sorry, and this, as I mentioned, this is the same as all of this. So let's just comment these two and run the same thing again, and that returns null. It's undefined as well because the user repository, so that really needs to be like an is set check. Let's do that. If is set user repository. In fact, I probably need to wrap this round. If is set. So yeah, we'll have to do, whoops. Yeah, give me a sec whilst I wrap this into an if set check. So if and then bring that out to there. And then, of course, have an else underneath this. Result equals null. Run this again. Null. Okay, so basically it's gone, okay, user repository has been set, or isn't set, and so we're not even going to do any of this stuff. If I was to say something like user repository equals, yeah, let's do equals null, so it is, or let's do an empty string, so it is set, so we're now in this part, but user repository find by, it's not an object, so that's going to throw an error. Yeah, so world of pain, world of pain. And I remember seeing legacy code where everything was wrapped around all of these crazy checks, but we don't have to do that anymore. And I just want to double check something. So if we ran, let's just clear the screen down. And if we ran that again, so it's clean, so it's null. Okay, let's clear that down again. Let's just comment all of this out because I just want to make sure that we're not having any kind of weird errors just on these two. So uncomment that one and uncomment this one and run that again. So we do have an undefined variable repository. Okay, so my bad. It needs to be defined. It needs to be defined as a variable. What we could do though is we could supply user repository up here. Oops. And we could set this to null. So it is defined, but it is null, and we get null back. Which probably means that we don't need to do this is set check anyway. So yeah, let's remove that and this. So let's say it was set. Let's say it was set, but it was set to null. So we should now just get two clean results of null. Null, null. Brilliant. Awesome. Okay. So, and do we have another example? We have a read-only example. Okay. Don't need that. The null safe operator is read-only. You cannot write values to it. Oh, yeah. So, we have a class subscription. Public string is status. Class is user. Private subscription is a subscription. The public function is get subscription. Subscription, return a subscription. What am I trying to do here? Oh, I'm trying to write to it. I see. So user get subscription. So user. So we instantiate a user. Do we? Is that right? User get subscription. Do we need to instantiate a user? I guess we do. I don't know why I didn't include that. Let's do user is equal to new user. Is that going to work? And then user get subscription status is active. And I guess if we did that, that would remove the errors. But we want to write to the status, which is active, and we cannot write to the null safe operator. So we can't say that this, if it's null, then we don't do anything about it. But if it isn't null, then the status is active. We can't do that. We can't do that because it is, as I mentioned up here, it is read-only. You cannot write values to it. I haven't actually seen anyone try and do this in the wild. Thankfully. Yeah. So let's just try and yeah, that should be all right. That should be all right as a tutorial. That should be fine. Okay. All right, let's see if we can get another one out. Let's clear down all of this. And let's work on the index. I don't know why I'm calling it index. I think as I started doing this, I wasn't sure how many examples each of these would have. It doesn't matter though. I haven't pushed this up to Git yet, so I can always change it. And I'm not saying what those are in here, but I suppose what we could do is change it. So it would be we could say that this is checking for null or something like that. Checking for null. Okay. And we want to just comment this line out, these lines out first, because I want to do an example of this. So user repository. Okay. Cool. All right. Maybe we could improve this somewhat. Maybe we could actually create a user repository. So maybe we could do class is user repository, and maybe we do a get public function find by ID, just as an example, int of ID, and so this could be a return of null, just to show that. So here user repository is a new, just to show that we can call find by ID and it's going to return null. or it's going to return get name. So maybe we create a new class called user, and we're just going to have a public function of get name, and it's going to be a return of Peter. So that returns a string, and that is like this, just as a very quick and dirty example where I can either return null or I can return a new user, and so this will return null or a user. That's probably easier, isn't it? So if we were to run this whole thing, so find by ID passing in the int would return a new user, which is up here, and we've got the get name. This should return the name, right? He says. So if we did PHP minus F, and what we're calling this, checking for null now, so that will return Peter. But at any stage, if for instance if we were returning null instead of returning the user here, we get null. Or if the user repository itself is null, then we also get null, right? So it's gone. Okay, we found it. The first example, we found the user by the ID, and we're returning the name. Next example was, well, the user returned null, so we're going to return null. So we're not going to call get name. And then the last example was the user repository itself is null, and so we're just going to return null. Okay, so that's how I'll do that. And then I'll demonstrate what the equivalent of all that is, which is this. And then I'll move on to the read-only part where we have a subscription and a user, and we're demonstrating that we can't adjust the status even though the status is public of the subscription. We can't write to it because we're using a null safe operator here. If we weren't doing that, that should be fine, because get subscription returns the subscription object, and the subscription object has a public status, so that would be fine. But because we're using the null safe, we can't do that, because we can't write to the null safe operator in that context. All right, cool. Onwards and upwards. So, okay, let's just clear down that screen. I want to work on this one first, so we'll just keep those two open for now. And we'll go back into this mode here where the chat is not shown on screen. So it's checking for null. Let's just make sure all of this is set up correctly. So we want to set that up. We want to set this up, and that's fine. And then down here is the check. All right, cool. Cool. PHP 8 comes with a null safe operator, which allows us to call functions and methods in a way that is safe if they return null. Let's say, for example, here we have this chain of calls. So the user repository calls find by ID, we supply the ID, and then we return the get name. Now, at each of these parts, we could be returning null. So for example, the user repository could be null, the find by ID could return null, and the get name itself could also return null. Now, before PHP 8, if the user repository returned null, then we would get an error where we're trying to call a function, a method on null. But what we can use is the null safe operator to prevent future calls within this chain from happening if we're returning null. And we do that using the question mark. So what this is doing is we're saying name is equal to the output of user repository. If the user repository is not null, then we call the find by ID. If the find by ID returns a user or something that isn't null, then we return the get name. This means that the name could either be null or it could be, in this case, a string. I'll show you up here as the classes. So we have a class user. The method is get name. It returns a string, which is just Peter here. The user repository itself has a method called find by ID. We supply the integer and it's either going to return null or a user. In this case, we're returning a new instantiation of the user class, which means that we can call the get name method from it, which is what this is doing here. So find by ID of the user repository and the get name of the user object. Now let's say, for example, that the find by ID was actually null. So I'm going to comment that out and return null. This would still work because the find by ID returns a null or a user. And if it's returning null, then we won't call get name. Instead, we will just return null. This is what the question mark does. Also, if, for instance, we were to have user repository set to null instead of the user repository itself, then the call would stop at this point, at this question mark, because this is null. So we won't call find by ID and we won't be calling get name because the user repository itself is null. Let me uncomment all of this and I'll give you a demonstration. So let's just uncomment all of those lines. So we're returning a new user object here, and the user repository is an instantiation of the user repository class. Okay, let's save that. And what I'm going to do is run PHP-F checking for null. That's going to return the string of Peter. That is because none of these are null. What I'm going to do now is instead we're going to comment out the new user and return null for the find by ID. Let's run that. And that's going to return null. It's not going to throw an error just because find by ID is null and we're trying to call get name, because we've got this null safe check here which says if this returns null, then the actual variable assignment is null and we do not proceed to call get name. Also, if, for instance, I was to set user repository to be null instead of the actual object, we stop at this check here. So let's run that. That returns null because the user repository is null and we've got the null safe operator check right here. Okay, so before PHP 8, we would have to run a lot of checks in order for this to work. I've got an example down here. Let me just comment out all of this and uncomment all of that. So we have if is null, user repository, result is equal to null. Else, so we have a user repository and it's not set to null, the user is equal to the user repository find by ID, passing in the ID that we want to find by. So in this case, it's 14. We then do another check. If the user is null, then the result is null. Else, the result is the user get name, or the result is the get name of the user object. And then we can var dump the result. If I was to save this here and run this again, we can see that we are returning null like so, which means that this single line is doing the equivalent of all of these checks down here. This is incredibly powerful for PHP. And I remember working on lots of legacy code where we had all sorts of these is null and is set checks littered around the code base, where now we can just put in question marks after the call of whatever we're trying to achieve. Now, one thing to remember with the null safe operator is that it cannot be written. We are only using it in read-only mode. So in this example, we have a class of subscription, and even though we have the property which is public of status, we can't write to it if the subscription is null. So we have the user, and this has the property of the subscription, as we can see here, and we're calling get subscription. If the subscription is null, then we return null, or we return the subscription. Now, even though this is public, we cannot write to it if we're using the null safe operator. So in this case, we have a user, we're instantiating that, and we're calling the get subscription method of the user, which should return us a subscription or null. And we're then saying, let's get the status of that subscription. And because it's public, we want to write to that status, which is active. Okay, so that's that. Let's move on. What's the time? 5:30. I think that pretty much covers those two. So I think what I'm going to do tomorrow is I'll edit those, and yeah, we should be good. We should be good on those two. Let's go back to here. So I think I'm going to call it a day for that. Let's just grab some more juice. It's tiring just speaking, tries your throat. Yeah, so thank you ever so much for joining. Thank you, Exabyte, for letting me know about the named parameters and suggesting or saying that how to define them. I've not used Dart before. I haven't had a chance to play with it, although I don't really know what I would do with it, to be fair. I always get Dart and Flutter mixed up. One of them is written by, I think it's Google. I don't know. I get confused. But also thank you, Exabyte, for letting me know how to change the stream category. I'll edit these, see how they go. And if they are up to scratch, then I might do some more. And we've got plenty more to do. If I was to get to my right thing here, we've got what the next thing, we've got sensitive attributes. These are fun. We've got union types, and we've got attributes. So with the sensitive attribute, we can now block sensitive values out of our stack traces, which is very, very handy. So that's an example of doing it without, and an example of doing it with. So without here, we've got username, password. We're throwing an exception, passing in the clear text of username, password, and we get to see the clear text password in our stack traces unless we run the sensitive parameters annotation or attribute. I don't know whether people should call it attribute or annotation. I think you can mix between the two, which it gets a bit confusing. So in the stack trace on this, when it's a sensitive parameter, that gets hidden in the stack trace, which is useful. And then we've got Boolean, we've got union types here. Oh yeah, this one's interesting. We can now supply false and true as our return types, as our data types, but we can't return like a union of true or false. We can't do like false and true. That's gonna fail. If you want to do that, then it should be a Boolean. I don't know what's example. Do something. Oh yeah, this is the an example of union types where we can supply all sorts of stuff and return all sorts of stuff at the same time using a pipe. Redundant aliases as well, so we can't use apples and foods. We can't say apples as foods. We can't use apples as foods, I should say. It will throw an error because it becomes redundant. And self, what's that about? Where we have pears and apples. For some reason, I was into fruit when I was doing this. We can also return self or pairs. So if 1 is equal to 2, then we return pairs. Else we return the current class, which is self or pairs. That's pretty handy as well. And then there's an example of dumping that out. And then what do we have up here? I think attributes. This is probably going to be the biggest one because with attributes, you really need to work with, say, reflection. Or I could demonstrate the deprecated stuff is pretty simple because you can now, these are inbuilt attributes. I'm going to be careful if it's, I've called it attributes up here. Some people call it annotations. Let's just keep it with attributes. So with this deprecation here, we're saying that use auth login, username, password, and then this is the second argument of that. Before we would use a doc block where we have @deprecated use auth login, username, password, and then this since blah blah blah, and then the timer example. This is the thing that's probably going to be a little bit more of a pain to do because this is an example of actually creating an attribute. So we're creating a attribute called timed, which is a class which has a construct of seconds. You pass that in as the parameter of the constructor here. Add the timed attribute to the process class with the seconds argument. So we've got it's timed seconds of 1. And then down here I have an example of how we can actually use the reflection class to I'm not showing this. I really need to show this. This is silly. This is why I need to get my Stream Deck up and running. So sorry about that. So this is the attribute. This is creating the attribute timed. It is a class, and you pass in this case, an integer of seconds, and you can then assign this attribute timed to another class. So in this case, we have the process, we've got execute, and we're sleeping for 2 seconds here. We're doing something, sleeping, and then done. Down here, we've got a reflection class where we are reflecting upon the process. We're getting the attributes, and we're getting the attribute of timed class. We then we reset those attributes, and we get a new instance of the object. And now we can get the seconds parameter or property of the timed attribute. So attribute object, which would be the process, the reflected process, we can now call seconds, which is here. So the idea with this example is basically trying to time a process and saying like this is the amount of time that's allowed for this process to run. So we've got time start is micro time is true. We run the process, we execute. We call the execute function of the process, and the process here, the execute method, it's going to do something. We sleep for 2 seconds, and then we echo out that it's done. And then down here, what we've got is time end micro time is true. And then we've got seconds is equal to time end minus time start. And then the total time is time end minus time start. So I probably need to adjust that because that doesn't make any sense. Total time is total time. Allowed is allowed seconds. Allowed seconds is what's defined on the attribute. And then this is time. Total time is allowed seconds. I could probably get rid of that, to be honest. Seconds, it's not being used. Yeah, let's do that. That doesn't make any sense. There we go. That threw me then. So time end. So total time is time end minus time start. So that's the total time in which this execute method ran for. The allowed seconds is whatever we're passing in to the attribute, and the time that's overran is the total time minus the allowed seconds. So if the allowed seconds was less than the total time, for example. That would give us a number. So that's the timer example. I'll go back to the other one, which was the deprecated example, where we have the it's an inbuilt attribute for PHP 8, where we used to use the .block where we would give two kind of arguments. The first one being the description. Second one is kind of like the since it was deprecated. And here we're saying that that this is the attribute, this is the replacement, where we're passing in the two arguments. The first one being the description, second one is the since, and this is in the box of PHP 8, so that's pretty useful. And because I screwed up with screens earlier, I'll give you a quick run through of the union types. So we now have the ability to supply false or true as the data type. We can't, however, do false or true like that. That has to be a Boolean. And then the example is, this is how we would call unions by using a pipe. So this takes all sorts of things and returns all sorts of things. Redundant aliases, so if we can't use the use statement, so using apples as foods, and we can't return apples or foods as a union, because that becomes redundant. And we can also return self or another class as well, or something else. So if 1 was equal to 2, then we return pairs, or we return the self itself. And then last but not least is the sensitive attribute. So without sensitive attributes, when we call like this login method, for instance, and we give it a username and a password all in clear text, if we call the var dump on a stack trace, if we return the stack trace, we actually return the password in clear text, which obviously isn't good, especially if you've got them in your logs. So what we have now is this sensitive parameter attribute, which means that we can associate the sensitive parameter on one of these parameters or all of these parameters, and so the stack trace will hide the actual value of this argument, in the stack trace. So that's what I'll probably do. That's what I'll do next, once I edit the ones that I've done today. And then after that, there's a whole bunch of other things that I need to do for future for other improvements to PHP, and this is all going into the course that I'm creating. So I've done the write-ups for constructor property promotion, match statement, null safe, sensitive parameters, union types, named arguments, and attributes. I need to do obviously the videos for this lot, which is what I'm doing here on stream. And then once I've done the videos for this lot, I'll then continue on. I mean, yeah, there's going to be loads, isn't there? Because PHP 8.5 recently just dropped with a whole bunch of new toys in there. I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth into the piping the stuff together. So that's that. Hey Sona40, how are you? My headphones are broke today, so can you reply me in chat? By the way, which game do you stream the most? I will reply to you in chat. Hello at Sona40. Hope you are well. I don't stream games. I don't stream games. I don't stream games as unfortunately I don't have the time. Right, so that's that. I am going to shoot off, and I'm shooting out tonight, and then I'll be back doing the edits for these things tomorrow, and then I don't know when I'll be back streaming. Haven't got a clue, just whenever I've got a free couple of hours. But I'll let everybody know by Twitter, obviously. I didn't today, I should have done, but this was kind of an experiment anyway. I'll see how it goes. So anyway, happy coding everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye bye. Bye bye.